Welcome to Standard 10C. In this standard, we will cite the causes and the consequences, the effects, of an important world event known as the Russian Revolution. This revolution breaks out in 1917 while World War I is going on. It's going to cause Russia to leave World War I. It's going to result in Russia becoming a communist country and really lays the groundwork for the Cold War, which we'll see in Standard 13. Some essential understanding to help us with this standard. Russia enters World War I still with an absolute monarchy, the type of which we would have seen in Western Europe back in the 16 and 1700s during the time of Louis XIV. Those Enlightenment ideas that had swept through Western Europe really hadn't changed this system of government in Russia. You're looking at a photograph here of the Russian Tsar, the Russian king at the time named Nicholas II. And Nicholas and his Romanov family had ruled Russia for over 300 years. We see Nicholas at the bottom of that list. He's just the latest in a long line of this family stretching back to the early 1600s. In fact, if you look at that list, we even see Peter the Great's name in there. He was a relative of Nicholas II. As a result of this non-changing system of government, there are developed very sharp divisions between the classes in Russia, between the nobles and the peasants. For example, in our picture here, we see Nicholas and his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, and Western European diplomats tended to remark on how fancy and lavish their fashion was. Okay, we see in this photograph here, they were dressed in a way that would have been more fitting for a king or a queen back in the time of Louis XIV in the 1600s rather than the early 1900s. The Romanovs were famous. You may have heard of Fabergé eggs. They were these very exquisite, hand-painted, handcrafted ceramic eggs. Some of which are worth over $1 million today. So between their fancy dress and giving each other these very fancy ceramic eggs, that was the lifestyle that they lived at the same time that the majority of Russians lived these very simple, very poor lives. World War I is going to shine a spotlight on these divisions and the heavy losses that Russia suffers during the war is going to result in a revolution in February of 1917 that overthrows the Tsar. This was led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky, and Kerensky promised some democratic reforms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these Enlightenment kind of ideas. But unfortunately for Kerensky and his provisional temporary government, they couldn't get Russia out of World War I fast enough. And that's really what the people were looking for. Russia hadn't really experienced the Industrial Revolution either, so technologically and militarily they were behind England, France, and Germany and suffered these heavy losses. The people wanted out of the war. And this first revolution in February doesn't get them out of the war. Later on that same year, this is the big event we need to know about. This guy, Vladimir Lenin, and his group known as the Bolsheviks, they're going to take power. They overthrow the temporary government who had overthrown Nicholas in October of 1917 to create what we came to know as the Soviet Union, which was a communist society. So this is the big important event. Lenin, the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, the takeover that led to a communist country known as the Soviet Union or the USSR. Here we see the Bolsheviks out in the streets of Russia. Okay, and our change from the old flag of Russia that flew during the time of Nicholas to the flag that flew over the Soviet Union. So we have two questions we're attempting to answer in this standard. The first is why, while World War I is going on, did Russia erupt? Why did it break out in revolution at this time? And we really have four reasons that we need to be familiar with. As we've mentioned, the first one is World War I. Russia suffers very heavy casualties, a lot of embarrassing defeats during the war, and that all gets blamed on the Tsar. As we see there, Tsar, the Russian word for king, it actually came from the name Caesar. Back in Roman times, Caesar, as that word moved through Europe to Russia, became Tsar. So for every dead Russian soldier, like we see in the photograph here, he left behind a girlfriend or a wife or kids or parents or friends who were blaming the Tsar who was still believed to be an absolute ruler, who was still believed to rule with divine right from God. He's piling up quite a bit of blame for the war. As we see here, Russia suffers 1.7 million dead in World War I. So that's quite a bit of blame piling up on the shoulders of the Tsar. Okay, our second reason is the Tsar himself. The Tsar at this point had been ruling for about 20 years. And the Tsar, it was very apparent to most people, he was just an incompetent ruler. That's not to say he was dumb, it's just that incompetent means he just didn't have the ability to be a really good ruler. We see that for some reason the standards bounce back and forth between CZAR and TSAR for the spelling of Tsar. Just be familiar with both of those terms there. We see the photograph here of Nicholas and his family. This is the Romanov family, and we just highlighted his youngest child, his son Alexei, who suffered from a condition called hemophilia, which means when he got cut, he didn't stop bleeding. His body lacked the clotting agents in the blood to stop him from bleeding, and he could have bled to death from relatively minor cuts. This guy, Rasputin, is often blamed in large part for the Tsar's incompetence. People saw the Tsar as being influenced by this guy. For whatever reason, when Rasputin was around, Alexei's hemophilia seemed to be under control. The problem was Rasputin, who was a Russian monk, he also had a reputation as a drunk and as a womanizer. So the Russian people kind of were thinking, hey, you're trusting this guy, around your family. Is he making decisions for you? And we see this reflected in this Russian cartoon of the time, where we see the large figure of Rasputin and Nicholas and his wife Alexandra there on Rasputin's knee, almost like they're children or puppets being manipulated by Rasputin. Okay, we have to go back about 12 years before the Russian Revolution for our third cause, which was Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. This was a relatively minor war in world history, but an important reason for the Russian Revolution. Russia and Japan fight this war in 1905 over spheres of influence in China. Both Russia and Japan had competing interests over the northeastern part of China, an area known as Manchuria, and Russia loses this war to Japan. Not only was this a smaller country defeating a bigger country, but it was the first time in over 200 years. Okay, for the length of time of the Industrial Revolution, no European country had been defeated by a non-European country. Okay, so here's Russia, a big European country, being defeated by a small non-European country. This was very embarrassing for Russia, and again, this was more blame being piled on the shoulders of the Tsar for this loss. In this cartoon from this period of time, we see Russia represented by the bear, and Japan represented by the hornets flying out of the nest here. And it's clear from the cartoonist point of view that Russia isn't doing very well in this fight against the hornets. Okay, and then our last reason were the landless peasantry, peasantry being the poor rural farmers. We mentioned earlier that the Enlightenment ideas hadn't taken hold in Russia the way they had in Western Europe. Back in your World I classes, you studied about feudalism. Okay, that system of protection and loyalty with the serfs and the manors and the lords and all that. That had been gone out of Western Europe for hundreds of years, but Russia didn't abolish that until the 1860s. Okay, and most Russian peasants, 60, almost 70 years later, they still didn't have land of their own. So they were more than willing to follow any revolutionary who came along, promising them an opportunity for some land. So those are our four reasons why Russia breaks out in revolution. Our second question is, how did communism, this idea that Karl Marx came up with, how does this take place and rise in Russia? And we'll look at this sort of as a timeline here. 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks were the group led by Vladimir Lenin, and their promise of bread, peace, and land. Bread meaning food, peace being withdrawal from World War I, and land for those poor peasants was the promise of the Bolshevik Revolution. We see they're going to change Russia to the Soviet Union. They're going to change Russia into a communist society. We see Lenin here with the broom, and communism's goal of making everyone equal has no room for people like kings and queens, has no room for rich merchants and bankers. It doesn't even have any room for religion and religious leaders. So we see Lenin with the broom sweeping all of those people off the globe. We see Russia surrendering to Germany here. In fact, Russia even gave up a big chunk of land just to get out of the war. And unfortunately for the Romanov family, the entire family, Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and all of his children are going to be killed. Not everybody in Russia, though, was happy with this outcome, that not everybody wanted a communist takeover. And from 1918 until 1922, a civil war breaks out inside of Russia between two sides known as the Reds and the Whites. Just like we saw in the English Civil War, Cavaliers and Roundheads. Our two sides here are the Reds, who were the communists, and the Whites, who were the non-communists. Not all of them were necessarily in favor of democracy. Some of them wanted a return of the monarchy, but they were united in their feeling against communism. Okay, but the Reds, the communists, are going to win the war. Okay, by 1921, Russia has been through 3 years of World War I. They've been through the Bolshevik Revolution. They've been through 4 years of civil war. Russia's just a mess. So much so that there's widespread starvation, not enough food's being grown to feed the Russian people, and there's widespread death from famine. Lenin realizes that government ownership of everything isn't working, so he introduces what's known as the New Economic Plan, or the NEP. This is going to allow some private ownership. Communism, pure communism, government owns everything. Lenin says we're going to let the people own some things. So, for example, the farmers were able to sell whatever excess crops they grew. This gave people some incentive, some motivation to work harder, produce more. And for the most part, this was a success. We can see in this chart here, we can see production of things like cattle and pigs and grain and coal were all going down from 1913 until 1921 when the new economic policy is introduced. And from that time on, the production of these things go up. Okay, so the new economic policy allowed some private ownership while still maintaining a communist setup. And then our last one here, 1924, Lenin dies after suffering a series of strokes. And these strokes left him unable to communicate, so he didn't have kids of his own, and he's not able to name his own successor. This guy, Joseph Stalin, who we see here on the right, on the picture sitting on the right next to Lenin, he's going to begin a very brutal rise to power. We'll talk more about Stalin in Standard 11, but for now we just need to know that Lenin's death leads to the rise of Joseph Stalin. And that's all we need to know for Standard 10C.